Okay, everybody, good morning. It's nice to see you all. We're, here again in our third installation of our SAR C.A.R.E.S speaker series. We have an incredible privilege this morning to hear from Dr. Micah Goodman. Dr. Micah Goodman is an acclaimed author, philosopher, public intellectual in the state of Israel, who is one of the most sought after speakers and presenters you're going to find around the Jewish world right now. Author of 5 books. I mentioned to him when we were speaking, one of his books I found to be, for me, a very formative experience. Myself personally reading it from my own sort of thinking about, Jewish philosophy. And I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Goodman to everybody. I do want to make just 2 quick announcements before handing it over to Dr. Goodman. One of them is a thank you, an appreciation to, it wasn't so easy. I didn't know how to get to Dr. Goodman, but we had the good fortune. Rachel Dayan, the mom of Max and Rebecca, knows Dr. Goodman and was able to kind of put us in touch. So I do want to thank the Dayan family for helping out with that. I'm going to monitor the chat just to kind of collect questions and answers, collect questions so that towards the end of Dr. Goodman's presentation, I'll moderate some of those questions. So with no further ado, it's a privilege, and I introduce to you Dr. Michael Goodman.
Hi, shalom everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be here, and this lecture is dedicated to my beloved Uncle Michael Fried, the father of Rachel and Miriam Fried, which are here with us. Rachel Dayan, sorry, to here with us. And now is Yom Yerushalayim in Israel. And this lecture is dedicated to try to figure out what happened in the 6-Day War. Or in other words, what really happened. Now, when history happens, it changes everything. Big war, gigantic victory, changes everything. The 6-Day War changed the Israeli political debate, and in 25 minutes, I want to try to explain what happened to Israeli political debate the past 53 years, and where does this debate stand today as we're talking? So, because as you know, the political debate in Israel came back through the question of sovereignty and annexation. The Trump plan, all this is fleshing out a very, very serious conversation or the public debate that Israelis have been having for the past 53 years. So in Israel, we have a saying, and here's how it goes. The 7th day of the 6-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. Let me say that again. The 7th day of the 6-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. That's our way of saying that in some way we're always the day after that war. That is our way of saying that war really transformed our thinking. Now here's what happens in the metaphoric day after the war. Many people wake up in the morning and they look around and they look at the Golan Heights. Now that's land that just yesterday used to belong to the Syrians. They want it back, and we have it. They look at the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and that's land that the Jordanians used to have. Now we have it. They want it back. They look to the south at the Sinai Peninsula, or maybe not the Gaza Strip, but the Sinai Peninsula, and the Egyptians want it back, and we have it. Now, this is a very good thing because for the first time in Israeli history, we have something we've never had before, and that is bargaining chips. We finally have something to offer, something to deal with. And they believe that if we play our cards right, we could exchange all this land for a peace treaty, and peace will transform Israel. Will stop being something that Moshe Dayan called Medinat Mivtzah, a fortress state, a state that's disconnected from the area, and will finally be an organic part of this part of the world. Will be an organic part of the Middle East. We won't just be located in the Middle East. We will be a part of the Middle East. And when that happens, you know what will happen according to this scenario? The world will finally really accept us. And Israel as a nation will be a real part of the family of nations, which means exile will end. No, I don't mean the exile from the land. I mean exile from humanity. To borrow a beautiful metaphor from Yossi Klein Halevi, the Sixth Day, if we leverage the victory in the Six-Day War, exile from humanity will end. That is transformation of Jewish history. Jewish history, in a deep sense, is a field that we're isolated. Am levadad yishkon. We're isolated. We're lonely. In some way, it's us against them. That's a great field that runs throughout Jewish history. But the Six-Day War enables us to make peace with our neighbors, peace that will lead to radical acceptance of Jews around the world, and Jewish history will finally be cured. So that's one great dream triggered and born as a result of the Six-Day War. You see, it wasn't only the peace people that woke up the day after the war. The metaphoric seventh day of the Six-Day War looked around and said, we have an opportunity here. There were other people, more biblical, more religious, and much more messianic. And they woke up in the day after, they looked around, and they didn't see diplomatic opportunities. They didn't see wearing the glasses that they were wearing. They didn't see bargaining chips. They saw something else. They saw the Tanakh. They saw the Bible. They saw Hebron, and that reminded them of Abraham and Yitzchak. They saw Bet-El, and that reminded them of Yaakov. They saw Bethlehem, and that's Rachel. They saw Yerushalayim, and that's David Veshlomo. They look at the land, and we're back in the Bible. It's important to mention. The Six-Day War was experienced as a miracle with biblical dimensions. In 6 days, Israel crushes 3 armies. In 6 days, only 6 days, Israel more than triples its size. In 6 days, a small country managed to do the impossible. At the same time, big America is losing in Vietnam, and small Israel is making the impossible possible. We destroyed the Egyptian army and Air Force in 4 hours only. It was a tremendous military. It was a tremendous victory. And it was experienced as a miracle in biblical dimensions. See, how biblical is that? A war that lasts 6 days. In 6 days of creation, Israel is created again. So this is a miracle that has biblical dimensions that brings us back to biblical land. Boom. So many people say, hey, what we should be doing is not trade this land for peace. We should return to this land, build homes in this land, settle this land, because the real gap in Jewish history is not between Jews and humanity. It's between Jews and their identity. We are back to ourselves. We are back in our land. We are back to our history. And guess what will happen when we settle the lands? We're fulfilling ancient prophecies. We're turning ancient prophecies into modern realities. And by doing that, imagine the Bible is a book with all these prophecies. By making the first prophecy a reality, you're making room for the next prophecy to become reality. And then the prophecy after that, which means by settling Judea and Samaria, you're starting a chain of cause and effect that will lead to Mashiach, lead to redemption. Transformation of Jewish history, maybe of all history. So you see, here you have 2 theories, 2 ideologies, exciting ideologies, triggered and born after the 6-Day War. One ideology of land, the second of peace. The ideology of peace that I started with assumes the problem of Jewish history, we're not connected to humanity. The ideology of land is we're not connected to our past, to our identity, to ourselves. Both believed the 6-Day War will solve their problem. Both believed that if we do the right thing with the fruits of victory, we could transform Jewish history. The peace camp says we'll connect to humanity and transform Jewish history. The land camp says we'll connect to ourselves and bring redemption and transform Jewish history. So you see how one war, one victory, creates a gigantic debate between 2 ideologies. And these ideologies start clashing throughout the 70s, heated debate throughout the 80s, extremely heated throughout the 90s. I want to remind you of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. a victim of the viciousness of this debate, the dimensions of this debate reached. And then something started happening in the year 2000. Something started happening. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll make a very long story short. Most Israelis start turning their backs to both ideologies. You see, today, almost all Israelis, if you ask them about peace, they don't believe peace is possible. They don't believe that if we leave the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, we'll have real, long-lasting, stable peace. For many, many reasons, Israelis are completely, not all Israelis, but most Israelis are disenchanted from the peace ideology. But I have news for you. Most Israelis don't believe that building settlements in the West Bank will bring Mashiach. Most Israelis think that's a mystical, irrational idea, not ours. And the story of the past 53 years is how two ideologies are born and two ideologies collapse. Most Israelis don't believe that settling the land will transform history, or leaving the land will transform history. Okay, you see, what really happened, that most Israelis started believing in something else. We moved from great ideologies to practical arguments. The left presents the following arguments. The left says, if Israel stays in the West Bank, we're going to control all this ancient sacred land, biblical land, but there's 2.5 million Palestinians living on this land. And by controlling this land, we're controlling 2.5 million Palestinians. And eventually all those Palestinians will actually ask to vote to be Israeli citizens and to vote for the Knesset. And the day where Israel will be presented with an impossible dilemma, are we going to make them citizens because we're controlling their lives? That day is getting closer and closer. And when that day comes, Israel is in trouble because our massive Jewish majority will be lost. And if the Jews are not a majority of the Jewish state, guess what? It's not a Jewish state anymore. And if you want to maintain a Jewish state, have a minority control another minority or a majority, you might be a Jewish state, not a democratic state, which means it's the end of Israel as we know it and love it. It's very serious. It's a very serious. We're risking the future of Israel by staying in the West Bank. That's the argument of the Israeli left. And I must say, I find this argument very persuasive. It's hard not to be persuaded by this argument. Take a look at Lebanon. What happens when you have one state divided by two nations? Look at Bosnia. What happens when different nations are trying to control the same state? It's chaos. It's a catastrophe. We don't want to go there. But the right has a great argument. It says, you know what happened if Israel leaves the West Bank? I'm sure learning in this great school you're learning and you know the map of Israel. So if Israel leaves Judea and Samaria, the distance between the eastern border of Israel and the Mediterranean Sea will be a little bit more than 10 miles. Can you imagine a country that is that narrow, around 10 miles? I'm pretty sure some people, some of you, are now more than 10 miles away from SAR. Am I right? You're more than 10 miles away from. That's the size of future Israel if there's a Israel from the West Bank. Now, in those 11 miles, in some places it's more, in that narrow part of Israel, that's where 60% of Israelis live. That's Tel Aviv area. So you have 60% of Israelis live in a narrow, narrow part of Israel between the Green Line and the Mediterranean. Is that borders we can defend? Well, we know we can't defend those borders. How do we know? Because in 1973, there was a surprise attack against Israel from the Golan and from Sinai, the Yom Kippur War. And it took Israel about 48 hours to get its act together and to try to push away the Egyptian army and the Syrian army. But until we got our act together, they conquered about 15 miles of Israel in the Golan Heights, in the Sinai Peninsula. I want you all to imagine the following scenario. What would happen if Israel would be surprised, listen to my question, like it was surprised in 73, but in the borders we had in 67. Following me? If we've been surprised like we were surprised in 73, surprise attack, Yom Kippur, it took us 48 hours to get our act together. In the meantime, they conquered 15 miles, but in the borders of 67, which means by the time we get our act together, where are they? In the Mediterranean. These are undefendable borders. Another evidence is undefendable borders is not 73, it's 2005. 2005, Israel leaves Gaza. Disengagement plan. After Israel leaves Gaza, so 60,000 Israelis living in the perimeter of 10, 15 miles of Gaza, Otef Aza, every now and then they have a bomb in their community. Their life is in fear. They are terrorized. What would happen if Israel leaves the West Bank like it left Gaza? It's very probable Hamas will take over the West Bank. It did in Gaza. And then all the Israelis who are living roughly 10, 15 miles from the West Bank will look like the current situation 10, 15 miles in Gaza. But that's not 60,000 people. That's the majority of Israel. You're jeopardizing the life of the majority of Israelis. Here's the conclusion. We can't leave Judea and Samaria. I find this argument extremely persuasive. If you learn the geography and you learn the history, you put it together and you realize we learned the geography, we learned 73, 2005, we put it together, we can't leave the West Bank. But what happens to people that are persuaded by the argument of the left and the right? What happens to people, by the way, like me, that think that if we stay in Judea and Samaria, we are risking our national majority? Oh, and by the way, if we leave Judea and Samaria, we are risking our national security. What happens then? I want to share something with all you students that are here with us today. Most Israelis are in this position. Most Israelis have an intuition that by staying in Judea and Samaria, we're risking our future. The problem is if we leave Judea and Samaria, we are risking our future. And here's something you should know about most Israelis. That the past 53 years, we moved from utopian ideologies of peace and land to being persuaded by two arguments, which means we moved from great ideologies to confusion. We're in a situation of confusion. Where does this confusion come from? It's very interesting. If I want to summarize this lecture, listen to what happened to the Israeli right. It used to say that if we stay in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, Mashiach will come. Now it says, if we leave the West Bank, there'll be a catastrophe, a security catastrophe. The left used to say that if we leave the West Bank, there'll be peace. That's like saying Mashiach will come. Now it's saying, if we stay in the West Bank, there'll be a catastrophe. Both right and left went through a very similar process, both moving from utopia to catastrophe, from messianic vision of the future to anxiety. And what happens, and with this I'll end, when the right changed and the left changed, where they're not saying if we stay in the West Bank, great things will happen. If we leave the West Bank, bad things will happen. And the left is saying the same thing, just the other way around. It's not saying if we leave the West Bank, amazing things will happen. It's saying if we stay in the West Bank, very bad things will happen. When they both shifted to that direction, something big happened in Israel. And with this observation, I'll end and open the floor. Psychologically speaking, when one side offers a dream, the other side offers a dream, you choose your dream. It's either or. Either you're for the dream of peace or you're for the dream of land. It's either or. We're playing the all or nothing game. But now one side is offering a catastrophe and the other side is offering catastrophe. Moving from dreams to anxieties. Now, psychologically, anxiety works differently because we can't have two different dreams. We can psychologically have and accumulate many different brands of anxiety. Anyone that suffers from anxiety knows, let's say you're afraid of closed places. You have a thing with closed places, like many people do. I have an issue with that. It's very easy to also have a problem with heights. Just add that on to your list of things you're afraid of. That's the thing. It's easy to accumulate anxieties, but you can't accumulate utopias. When Israeli political conversation shifted from dreams to anxieties, it created a gigantic center in Israel. Those are the Israelis that are not between right and left. They are simultaneously right and left. They believe that if we stay in the West Bank, we're in trouble. If we leave the West Bank, we're in trouble, because they accumulated the anxiety of the right and the anxiety of the left. The anxiety of occupation and the anxiety of withdrawal is in the minds of hearts simultaneously of many Israelis. This is why Israelis lost their certainty. And this is something you should know about us here, this side of the world. Israelis seem, they radiate certainty. There's something about our body language. We were in the military, we know, we understand, trust me, dog, cat, I understand, we are Israelis, and we know, we radiate that sense of, we know what we're doing. But there's a gap between the body language of Israelis, which radiates certainty, and the new politics of Israelis, that we lost our certainty. And that, my friends, is a window into everything that is interesting in Israel today. You know why? Because when people lose their political, ideological certainty, that's when they become curious again. Because when you think you know the truth, you have answers, you don't ask questions. Today, Israelis, many of them, most of them, lost their answers. We're asking a lot of questions, and many of these questions are going to be asked in July 2020, where heated debate about annexation and sovereignty is going to hit Israel. That was my spiel this morning.
Hi, thank you very much for that extraordinary presentation. There are a few questions that have come up in the chat that I'm going to sort of moderate. I want to mention maybe a couple of them together, and you can feel free to kind of respond. You know, I guess the one of the questions being asked was like, what other sort of factors should we be considering? You can see it perhaps in the chat yourself. You know, not just security as an anxiety, or security, or peace, or controlling. Like, I guess someone asked about the extent to which morality plays a role, and what other sort of considerations are there beyond the ones that you discussed is one question. Another question I threw out there as well, if you just, you know, I know you mentioned something about, so I think at some point we were talking about something about coronavirus as well. I thought you said you mentioned you want to say something. Just yes. Those two things, and I'm sure there'll be more questions, but feel free.
Yes. So the ethical question is a very, very big question here. I think it's a question that we can't, as Jews, we can't ignore. I'll put this question in my words, okay? I don't think we came back to Eretz Yisrael to control another nation. That's not what Zionism was ever about. We didn't sign up for this. For a military regime controlling a civilian population, that's not what Zionism was ever about. But we also didn't return to Eretz Yisrael in order to be threatened by another nation. That's also what Zionism was never about. You see, here's the problem. Zionism was always about two things: liberty and security. It was about the liberation of a nation, the Jewish people. It was about security for a nation. Now, what happens when we control another nation? So that's a violation of Zionism. Because Zionism is about liberation of nations. A Zionism that occupies another nation is anti-Zionism. Therefore, the Zionist thing to do is to leave Judea and Samaria. But the problem is, Zionism is also, the Jewish people were always under threat. We came home to a safe refuge, not to be under threat. And if we leave Judea and Samaria, the Jewish people will be under threat again. Therefore, leaving Judea and Samaria is against Zionism. See the problem? Staying in Judea and Samaria is against Zionism, the ethical idea of national liberty. Leaving Judea and Samaria is against Zionism, the great ethical idea of national security. What's the right thing to do? It's confusing. There's a catch here. There's a serious catch here. It's a catch I call, so not catch 22, it's a catch 67. There's a serious catch here. And I think the debate only really begins in a sophisticated, interesting, creative way when we understand that there's a real catch here. Don't let anyone deny that both sides are right. People that say if we leave the West Bank, we could be safe and secure and not under threat and undermine the security risks. Yes? Question people that say we could stay in the West Bank and it's ethical and okay. Question that. What happens when you question both sides? What happens if you have a real critical thinker? You find yourself in a position where you realize the right thing to do is to stay in the West Bank and leave the West Bank. That's the right thing to do. To leave Judea and Samaria and stay in Judea and Samaria, that's the right thing to do. This is a paradox. This is an enigma. I think we can figure this out. I think there's a way out. I think there's a creative way out. But there's only a way out of a problem if you don't deny that there's a real problem. Now the Corona question is kind of like, how do we think about the way out? So here's what I like about the way we think about Corona. When you think about the way experts think about Corona, we agree on some very serious assumptions. Assumption number one, no one wants to threaten the health system. Assumption number two, no one wants to destroy the economic system. The problem is there's some kind of a zero-sum game between the health system and the economic system, because the great fear is that if no one will be in quarantine, everybody's out in the streets, you guys are back in school, people out in restaurants, the plague spreads, everyone goes to the hospital has not enough beds and machines to take care of you, the health system collapses. So if there's no quarantine, it's great for the economy, but it threatens the health system. So what do? Let's put everyone in quarantine, everyone in isolation, not let anyone out for an entire year. We'll kill the pandemic. But there's a problem. If everyone's in their homes, we're threatening the economy. The economy could collapse, right? So there's a catch here, right? If we're at home, we're protecting the health system, threatening the economy. If we're out, the economy's safe, we're threatening the health system. Now here's the interesting thing. Okay, so we realize there's two systems, and anybody's asking, how do we save the economy without jeopardizing the health system? Or how do we save the health system without really crushing the economy? We're searching for a maneuver that would prevent both catastrophes. I don't find binary thinking in Corona. I don't see people saying we need to only protect the health system, even if it means sacrificing the entire economy. I don't hear anybody saying, let's protect the economy and deny that there's a problem for the health system. The smart people, they're not speaking that way. They're not binary thinkers. They're holistic thinkers. They realize we have to prevent a catastrophe for the economic system. And to do that, it can't be on the expense of a catastrophe for the health system. Now, this way of thinking is so healthy. Because for 53 years, we've been debating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict using binary categories. One side is saying two-state solution is dangerous. If we leave the West Bank, there'll be rockets on Tel Aviv. But the problem is, if we stay in the West Bank, there might be a one-state solution, which is a catastrophe. Okay, so in order to prevent one catastrophe, we're triggering a different catastrophe. Other people say, we have to prevent the one-state catastrophe. Right? We have to prevent that. So we leave the West Bank, we're creating another catastrophe of rockets in Tel Aviv. But I find in the debate over the future of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, a lot of binary thinking. The right has its catastrophe that we have to prevent, rockets on Tel Aviv, the two-state situation. The left has another catastrophe that it has to protect and prevent from happening, the demographic threat, the one-state solution. Why can't we have both catastrophes that we need to prevent? Why can't we find a maneuver that prevents the one-state catastrophe without creating the catastrophe that might happen if there'll be a two-state solution? So this is what I call let's think Corona. In Corona, we're training our minds not to think in binary thinking, not to prevent one catastrophe by triggering another one, but how to prevent in parallel two catastrophes. I think that's exactly the way we should be thinking. This is how pragmatists should be thinking about the conflict. And in that sense, I believe that Corona is training our mind to think politically in a healthier way regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That was pretty fascinating. Thanks for sharing that insight. I'm going to ask 3 more questions right now, and feel free to, kind of respond to any of these 3 questions and however you see fit. One of the questions was raised compellingly by one of our Tanakh teachers was sort of describing the, kind of commenting that the anxieties and dreams that you're sort of describing sounds similar to sometimes some conflicts you'll have in the Nevi'im between Nevi'im and Melachim. And the question she's asking is, do you think that there are any, do you think that there are any texts in our tradition, whether it's Tanakh, Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought, and halakha, that would be, interesting to mine for ways out of or to help us think about this? That's one question. You can think about that for a second. Another question was, I think interesting as well about, sort of, do you feel that there's when people present 2 different extremes, let's say politicians or leaders often are, there's certain slogans that are sort of on the extremes, does that ignore or create difficulty for, as you're describing, the broad middle, which is the biggest group that's kind of like not on that extreme or not on that extreme, that we're living in with both sort of like, the conflict, the confusion in their minds? Does that broad middle sort of get underrepresented because in the public sphere, sort of like the more extreme slogans are the ones that get the most play? That's a second question. I know it's lost a lot there. And the third one I'm going to say is asked by appropriately by one of our school psychologists, who points out that he heard that the antidote to anxiety is faith. Do you think there's anything that can give Israelis the hope that they need in order to transcend the anxieties? That's like, a mental health perspective appropriately from our school.
Okay, these are 3 gigantic questions.
Yes.
Yes. I'll try to address, will we have more questions after these, or should I use all my time to answer these questions?
Let me take a look. Listen, some people are asking also about, I'm just reading. You know what? There'll be another question or 2. So I'm going to go back and take a look through the chat as you go along. So let's assume, guys, we're going to end at 11:35 promptly. So we've got 30 minutes. So I'm going to kind of gauge yourself for that. I'm going to try to get another question or 2 in after you respond to those if you can.
Okay, great. So I'll start with the Tanakh question. The Tanakh. If we're searching for guidance in the Tanakh, in the Bible, what to do, how do we deal with this is what we find. The Tanakh is a text that synthesizes law and narrative, which is a chidush. In the ancient Near East, there were narratives, mythologies, Gilgamesh, there were laws, there were codes of law, Hammurabi. The Tanakh comes and it says, and it merges narrative, storytelling with laws, and that became, by the way, a part of Jewish literature. In the Talmud, it's halacha ve'agada, stories, narratives, ideas, imagination, and hardcore legal discussions. And if we look into the stories of the Tanakh, we will find that Eretz Yisrael is in the heart of the biblical narrative. You don't have to be a biblical scholar to see this. What's the first commandment that Abraham ever gets? Lech lecha, leave your home, walk away. Where does he walk? To Eretz Yisrael. We look in Sefer Shmot. What's the story of the book of Exodus? Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Jewish people escaping Egypt, going where? To Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, to Eretz Yisrael. So Bereshit is about leaving Mesopotamia. Shmot is about leaving Egypt. Both stories about the movement to Eretz Yisrael. They come to Eretz Yisrael, and Deuteronomy, Moshe says to them, you know what will be your punishment if you really, really violate the covenants? Well, if you violate the covenants, your punishment will be exile for the land of Israel. So Israel is the heart of the story. This is where we go. This is where we are punished when we leave. It's the heart of the story. You go there, you leave, you come back. In some way, the Bible, the heart of the biblical narrative, is the relationship between Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, the people of Israel and the land of Israel. So when you read that, you say, wow, Israel should never leave Judea and Samaria. It's the heart of the Bible. By leaving this land, we're turning our backs to the Bible. And there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of people believe that. But let's look again into the Bible. If we look now, not in the stories and the narratives, but in the law, there is one law that repeats itself more than any other law. And that is, ve'ahavtem et hagir. You should love the foreigner. Ger in the Bible is not a convert. That's ger in the language of the Talmud. Ger in the Bible is the minority. Ki geirim eitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You used to be minorities in Egypt. And you should love minorities. You know how much you should love minorities? As much as you love yourself. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. Ve'ahavta lo kamocha, the ger, the minority. Sensitivity towards minorities is repeated 36 times throughout the Torah. More than Shabbat, much more than Kashrut, more than building Bet HaMikdash. If there is one leitmotif, dominant motif in the law, it's sensitivity towards powerless minorities. So I would say that if you're listening to the dominant voice in biblical law, you're guided to leave the West Bank. Because if staying in the West Bank means having a military regime controlling civilian population, that is a violation of ve'atem yeda'atem et nefesh hagir ki geirim eitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. It's a violation of you should love the minority, because remember how it felt to be a minority when you yourself were a minority in Egypt. And here is the catch. This is the biblical catch. The biblical catch is the most important motif in the narrative is land. The most important motif in the law is sensitivity towards gerim, towards minorities. What happens when the narrative and law clash? So when we search for guidance in the Bible, what we have is catch 67. The Bible guides us to leave the West Bank. The Bible guides us to stay in the West Bank. Many times people have questions. They go to the Bible to find answers. And what happens in the Bible, we don't find the answer. We find the question. The question is amplified. So that's regarding the Tanakh question. Let me now discuss the issue of what happens when politicians speak the way they have a tendency to speak. And yes, America is not unique. Also in Israel, we have this issue. It's actually a global issue for many reasons. It has to do with the fact that ever since politics immigrates to social media, politics started becoming very, very extreme, very, very, very vulgar. Everybody's in search for attention, for traffic, and the conversation deteriorates. I want to say something about any of this. This might be true only about Israel. America is polarized. Liberal Americans and conservative Americans can't understand each other. They can't listen to each other. They offend each other. This is true also in Brazil. My book is coming out now in Brazil, so I'm following Brazilian politics. Yes, very, very serious polarization. What's his name? Roberts, the guy that wrote Robert Putnam from Harvard University, which is studying polarization in America. He says America was never the entire 20th century, America wasn't as polarized as it is today. Now, also Israel is polarized, but it's different. The polarization of politics in America reflects a nation that's polarized. Israelis, on the other hand, are not that polarized. And the polarization of our politics doesn't reflect the polarization of a society. It actually masks, disguises the fact that our society is not that polarized. That's the paradox of Israel. A society that's not polarized has politics that is very polarized. That's the paradox, the uniqueness of Israel in that sense. Now, I want to offer a vision for a center, for a broad center. You know how in the Talmud, the Bat Kol, there's a revelation of divine voice that comes out. And Beit Hillel says, halacha is according to us. And Beit Shammai says, halacha is according to us. And the Bat Kol comes out and says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. You contradict each other, you have opposite positions, and you are both right. The Talmud in the Yerushalayim says that the best of Talmudic scholarship is to understand every argument, opposing argument, from 40. You could give a great scholar is a person that could give 49 reasons why one side is right, and then 49 reasons why the other side is right. This is what I want to call holistic thinking. This is what the ancient Chinese philosophers called yin and yang. Where's the truth, in the yin or the yang? In Hillel or in Shammai? The truth is not on one side, it's not on the other side. It's a holistic vision that contains both. A weak center is a center that's between right and left. A passionate center is a center that's holistic. It contains within it the vision of the right and the vision of the left. I think a healing vision for politics is a centrist vision that is not the middle, it's holistic. It sees the light on both sides. It really listens to the Talmud that says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. Those and those are the words of the living God. And by seeing the truth, the light in both sides, now that's a different center. It's a holistic center. And when you see the light in both sides, you can also become pragmatic. Why? I'm going to say one thought here is that when you ask now what to do, well, I could take the best practices from the right, the best ideas of the left, put them together, do what's most effective, because pragmatism is not about asking what's right, it's about asking what works. But it's easy to ask what's right, to move from what's right to what works. When you believe that, you know what, maybe everyone here got something right, so we can leave that question and now ask what works. And I think this vision for this center, a holistic center, and not the weak vision of the middle, like nicht here, nicht there. It's like very parv, very mediocre. When you're centrist because you're in the middle, you're centrist because you believe less. When you're centrist because you're holistic, you're centrist because you believe more. And that's my vision for a healing center. And finally, I want to say something that maybe is controversial. Do we need hope as an antidote for anxiety? Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, one of Jewish greatest philosophers, said that hope is not the antidote to anxiety. Hope is what triggers anxiety. Because the minute you have hope, one moment, the hope could transform into anxiety. Because what is hope and anxiety? They're two emotions where the way I experience the present is dependent on the way I imagine the future. And if I imagine the future to be amazing, I feel nice in the present. If I imagine the future to be a catastrophe, I feel horrible in the present. So I'm emotionally dependent on how I imagine the future. I think the real antidote to anxiety is not to imagine a different future, but to stop imagining the future. It's to locate your mind in the present. It's very hard, especially for Western people, to be present. But I have two pieces of advice here. One, the more time you spend on your screens, the harder it is for your mind to be present where you are. And two, mindfulness meditation is a technique that trains your mind to be more in the present. So the antidote to anxiety is not changing our vision of the future. It's about liberating myself from the future and being all in with the person I'm with, the moment I am present in, to be all in at this moment, here and now.
Okay, there are so many more questions in the chat box and I know we have to end in like a minute. So I want to apologize, but I do want to mention that Kayla Bellin just mentioned to me privately in the chat box that I should remind all students that at the next activity period, the Achenu group is going to be meeting, and we'll be discussing many of the topics that were raised today by Dr. Goodman. So for those of you who have not had enough here today, which I think is most of us, we will be able to continue that. So a lot of these issues in our conversation together during the next activity period with Achenu. And I apologize that we're kind of out of time, but at a certain measure, it's good to end with people wanting more. So I do want to thank Dr. Michael Goodman for what this morning was a really enthralling and captivating way of looking at our reality. I think an approach that many of us find very appealing and with a lot of insights that we had never really considered before. So as we approach Yom Yerushalayim tomorrow, and think about where we are, where we've been, and where we're going, I want to thank you for the guidance you provided today. And we look forward to, now that we've made this connection, maybe being in touch more often. So thank you very much, Dr. Goodman. It was an honor and a privilege really to hear from you this morning. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Toda rabba. Be in the present. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.